gonna do a quick. I'm just gonna skim through this video. It's They Came a Viking. It's the Raymond Cap. Get it through Shepherd's Chapel or see my links. And this is gonna be a quick true story and real true facts, not nonsense that you find on TV and stuff, of the Vikings, the Norsemen. Just gonna skim through it, so bear with me.
Vikings are coming. The Vikings are coming. The Vikings are coming.
They came from the cold and hostile north, pillaging monasteries and putting whole villages to fire and sword, and they profaned the churches. From the 8th century in England, all places of worship resounded with a new and fervent prayer. Deliver us, O Lord, from the fury of the Norsemen. The fear the monastic clergy had for these violent raiders was vividly penned by one of the English monks.
The bitter wind is high tonight, it lifts the white locks of the sea. In such wild storm, no fright of savage Viking troubles me. They have desecrated the sanctuaries of God and poured out the blood of saints around the temple of the Most High.
So wrote the scholar Alcuin.
Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. And they came to the church on Lindisfarne and seized all the treasures of the Holy Church. They killed some of the brothers, some they took away with them in fetters, and many they drove out naked and loaded with insults, and some they drove into the sea and drowned.
This cruel and violent raid is illustrated on the Viking stone in Lindisfarne Museum, showing the raiders coming ashore with their axes raised.
I'm just gonna skim through this, so bear with me.
Towards the end of the 8th century AD, Scandinavia, composed of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, had only a population of about 2 million. But from the start of the 9th, its peoples began to increase significantly. There were several reasons for this. The northern climate was slowly getting warmer and harvests were increasing. Thus the people were being better fed and getting stronger. More and more living room became essential. Scandinavia was a land where habitable areas were few and far between. Thus the Viking people began to look outward from their home, towards the west.
Okay, I'm a Viking. The Raymond Cap. This is the Raymond Cap. Biblical archaeologist. And see what he's got to say.
I am E. Raymond Cap, biblical archaeologist and historian. Countless books have been written about the short Viking period between the 8th century AD and the 11th century. But written records contemporary with that period are rare. Just a few sagas telling of their deeds, which vary between the boastful and the mystical. There are reports, mostly from their victims, Viking raids on monasteries, mass murder of entire communities, and the taking away of male and female slaves.
I'd like to state this is for educational purposes only.
Slaves. However, spectacular archaeological discoveries in modern times have made it possible to piece together not only their beautiful ships, but what the Viking Age was really like. And it turns out to be a somewhat different scenario than that which had been previously been told. They developed just laws, a system of democracy, the basis of which has been adopted by many modern nations. In this program, you will be presented with a wider view and a fresh perspective of the Vikings, who became a major influence throughout Western Europe, and most importantly, reveal the little-known biblical origin of the northern European peoples, out of whom at a later stage came the Vikings.
The origin of the word Viking is obscure. It is most likely based on the Old Norse word vik, which means fjord or inlet. Thus, as most Viking longships started their long journeys from such inlets, they went a Viking. But just who were they, these swift and terrible men who came from the icy places in the far north and the snow-covered mountains and fjords of Scandinavia. The Northumbrian scholar Alcuin claimed these violent raids were a punishment of the sinful English. He admonished them, like the ancient prophets of Israel, on account of their adultery, avarice, robbery, violent judgments, luxury, long hair, and flashy clothing. The Franks of France called them Northmen or Normans, which gave the name to the country Normandy, and the Germans simply called them shipmen. Shipmen indeed, for the Vikings were people of the sea. Their long ships, some of the most elegant sea-going craft ever constructed.
Alright, so they were good shipbuilders. Let's just skim through here.
Harvey. Ships. Yeah, the
They love their ships.
been reconstructed. And a beautiful,
Bear with me.
a loving. No plans were used by the shipwrights, but they shaped them until they looked right, all by eye. And they lovingly decorated their curving prows with animal carvings. What so astonished the coastal hamlets and villages of England was the speed of the Viking raids. Their ships would suddenly appear out of the morning mist, running up the surf to ground on the beach, disgorging a double line of yelling, howling, shaggy men, all armed to the teeth. The Vikings were well aware of the psychological effect of surprise, speed, and noise to strike panic into the population. Then, after only a few hours ashore, they would vanish out again into the cold, gray North Sea, laden with monastery treasures, gold, jewels, and illuminated manuscripts, and in particular, silver. It was silver the Vikings especially coveted, and they left usually not without male and female prisoners, although some of the girls became quite willing brides, perhaps glad to be rid of their quiet life on the English coast. In addition to slaves, the Vikings were not averse to cattle rustling, and whenever they saw a danger of running short of milk or meat, a trip to the English coastline invariably provided a cow or two. Vikings made many raids up the broad rivers of Europe to sack and burn the monasteries, the best source of booty.
Getting to it. That's not all they did. We're getting up to that, so bear with me. I'm going to skim through it just real quick. Like I said, they came a Viking. He ran a cap. You can find it under Shepherd's Chapel and other places.
After one such successful raid upriver in France, one prisoner, Popa, the daughter of the Count of Bayeux, stands defiantly before the Viking chief, Hrolf, who later married this beautiful captive. In the 10th century, Paris, capital city of France, was then only a group of houses and churches confined to an island in the middle of the river Seine. Ragnar the Dane, with a fleet of 120 ships, sailed up the river and besieged the town for some months, but was eventually persuaded to leave with a present of some 7,000 pounds weight of silver. This set a precedent much copied by other Vikings. Why bother to put the city to fire and sword when you can terrorize the inhabitants into emptying their vaults? There were so many placid rivers in northwest Europe that access to the hinterland was easy for Viking ships. London was another lucrative target. This is the modern London Bridge. Olaf Haraldsson's fleet sailed up the River Thames and secured ropes to the piles supporting the bridge across the river. Then, all the ships pulling together downstream, they uprooted the bridge, which collapsed into the Thames mud. The sole casualty, according to tradition, was one Viking who laughed so much that he fell overboard and was drowned. In the days before astronomical scholars put forward the outrageous theory that the Earth was not flat, captains of European ships preferred to keep the land in sight. To leave it and sail to the horizon would endanger the ship falling off the edge.
Okay, so we'll skip over here a little bit.
Saw a land horizon. Norse captains, on the other hand, kept the carved prows of their longships headed for the far horizon, until shortly before 1000 AD, one ship, blown further west than any before, saw a land which they referred to as well-wooded and with low hills, America. However, this ship did not land but sailed on. Ships such as this reconstruction on the cliff top at Ramsgate, Kent, were the first to sight the New World, long centuries before Christopher Columbus's fleet arrived.
Exactly.
In such a ship, Leif Erikson decided to explore this new land, and arriving on the coast, he sailed along a grim cliff-lined shore, which he named Hyrogliph. Further south, he landed his crew on a sandy beach with well-forested hills inland, which he named Markland. This was Labrador. Recorded in this saga is Leif Erikson's overall name for this newly discovered part of America, Vinland. Vikings from Greenland made one further attempt to colonize Labrador, and early in the 11th century, 3 ships landed and formed a small community. At first, encounters with the local Indian tribes was on a friendly basis, with many goods being exchanged and bartered. Indeed, so amicable were the initial contacts that even this young Viking girl appeared to have no fear of these well-armed tribesmen. Keen though they were on the fresh milk from the cows the Vikings brought with them, they were somewhat wary of the wild antics of this one. Later still, another explorer named Thorald landed even further south and encountered a different group of Indians whom he named the Skraelings. But for no apparent reason, he killed 8 of them. A fatal mistake, for later on a mass attack by the Skraelings killed Thorald and some of his crew. During the 3 years of the colony's existence, a baby boy was born who was named Snorri, the first Nordic child to be born in America. But due to the continual enmity between the Skraelings and the Vikings, which often resulted in vicious local wars, the colony failed, and the remainder returned to Greenland. America was thus encountered and settled by the Nordic peoples long before Columbus. Remains of the first Viking settlement was discovered by the Norwegian scholar and historian Helge Ingstad in 1962 when he found the remains of a village on the northern tip of Newfoundland at Leonce aux Meadows. It is believed that Viking exploration went as far south as Virginia. So much for the West. Exploration in the East was not accomplished without considerable resistance, and many Vikings never saw their homeland again. But Swedish Vikings were greedy for the exotic wares of Araby and explored up wild, uncharted rivers in Russia as far as the Black Sea. They ruled Novgorod and founded a dynasty at Kiev. They even dared to attack that mightiest of cities, Constantinople, now Istanbul, where the Viking chief symbolically hung his shield on the gateway of the city. The Vikings' valor and bravery in war so impressed the Byzantine rulers that they recruited them into an elite military unit, the Varangian Guard, which for centuries protected the person of the emperor. Vikings are usually thought of as spending all their time raiding, but this is incorrect. They were basically traders, trading from Spain to the Black Sea and from Scandinavia to North Africa and Egypt. One of the more important trading centers was Hedeby, on the German-Danish border. It controlled the routes from Uruk to the Baltic Seas. In such trade centers was produced iron tools for the farmer, weapons for the warrior, bone and antler carvings, including chess sets, bronze castings, leatherwork, furs, skins, walrus ivory, pine marten pelt.
Yeah, let's skip along here. You can also go and see the rune stones in West Virginia, and Vulgar writings and carvings in stone in America, all the way back as far as 800 BC, or maybe before. Ancient Hebrew, Celtic writing, Viking writing, Vulgar, Ogham.
Vikings indulged
Come up.
in Saxon girls for slave markets. This one sells a young Saxon girl from England. Although it is true that the Vikings indulged in slave trading prior to their conversion to Christianity, usually the girls were well treated, and many became brides of the Vikings. The traditional belief that the average Viking was a bewhiskered, evil-smelling, and usually inebriated lout can now be balanced by some terse notes in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which referred somewhat petulantly to the unfair advantage Viking youths had for the favors of English girls, as the young men spent much of their time ensuring the cleanliness of their clothing, bathing frequently, and combing their long blonde hair and beards, if any. Judging by the many combs found in graves and needles for the stitching and repair of clothing, Vikings seem to be very conscious of their appearance, and even the Viking chieftain had to submit to a haircut while his wife stood by, being critical.
Alright, we're gonna move along here. Get to some other facts.
But vicious of
bear with me, hold on here. Just gotta find it.
tape, music,
Okay, here we go. Coming up.
talk,
Like I said, it's called They Came a Viking.
built at Hyroglyph.
Some of the houses they built here.
This was impassable to enemy forces, an ideal defensive position. The longship outline is plainly visible. A replica Viking longhouse has been built at Hyroglyph, showing just how strong these structures had to be to withstand the violent northern gales. The thick reed thatch lasted at least 50 years, warm in winter and cool in summer, and the whole structure was massively braced by heavy logs all around. Over 40 Viking graves have been found on the Isle of Man, a large island in the Irish Sea between Wales and Ireland. Graves dating back from the 10th century, which is hardly surprising, as Man was used as a base for operations against English and Irish coastal towns by the Viking warrior class, who often intermarried with the local girls. As in Denmark, these Vikings were buried in boat-shaped graves, a comforting thought to the dying chieftain to know that he would shortly be sailing to Valhalla to be greeted by the Valkyries, to feast, to fight, and to drink till the end of time. Although the island is subject to the British Crown, Man has its own parliament, the Tinwald, a word derived from the Icelandic Thingvellir, or assembly field.
It's not getting good now. Pay attention, it's gonna start getting good.
Events have been Parliamentary events have been part of Manx life here for 1,000 years. Not far from the Isle of Man is Dublin, capital.
Facts are always good.
Not far from the Isle of Man is Dublin, capital city of Ireland. Vikings lived and traded here for many years until after the Battle of Clontarf, when they were finally driven out of Ireland. The foundations of their many trading posts have been discovered near this location beneath the city.
So they fight with Brian, and the Vikings got beat by the Irish.
British
Go to the monks here.
prayers were answered, for the Vikings were Christian religion. Monastic life was the center of the Christian religion in the days of the Vikings over the length and breadth of the British Isles. On Lindisfarne, or Holy Island, the life of the monk was long and arduous. It takes much concentration and effort to rise from one's hard bed at 3 o'clock on an icy morning to attend prayers in an unheated chapel. But there were tools to be made and sandals to be fashioned, as monks spent as much time on their feet as on their knees.
I'll show some of the tools here. Let's skip through. Get to some facts. Hold on.
To be done. A sewing of religious vestments to be done for bishop and serving maid alike. There were domestic animals to be attended to and children to be taught the tenets of the Christian faith by their parents. And it was into this peaceful existence that the fury came out of the north. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that on the 8th of June, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, or Holy Island as it is called, and there was much slaughter. Until recently, most historians dismissed the Norsemen as little more than raiders on a grand scale. Their opinions were formed from accounts written by English chroniclers who somewhat naturally portrayed the Vikings in their worst possible light. Raiders, yes, but they were also great explorers and traders.
Probably Kenites over there mixing into the England.
Then they sailed to all parts of the then known world, bartering furs and slaves.
Those who claim to be Jews but lie and are the synagogue of Satan, the bloodline. Cain, Satan's child. Revelation 2:9-3:9. John chapter 8, verse 44. Christ's words. Be a father of the devil. That's sperma, male sperm in the Greek.
Then known world, bartering furs and slaves for the luxuries of Southeast Europe. Their commercial journeys took them as far as Asia Minor and Arabia. Constantinople was a frequent port of call. One Arab merchant described the Vikings as people of perfect physique, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. Small wonder then that some of the female captives were not entirely unhappy about their capture.
I'd like to add that Adam, the man Adam, not the sixth-day creation. You can watch my video, Sixth-Day Creation. And means in Hebrew, ready complected, to show blood in the face. The man Adam, ruddy, ready complected. 120 in the Hebrew dictionary.
But raiding was basically a summer occupation,
Adamic
and while the long
bloodline,
ships
Christ bloodline, who Christ came through, the Adamic bloodline.
during the summer occupation, and while the long ships swung at their anchor chains during the winter, Viking merchant shipping continued their work day after day, winter and summer, carrying goods far and wide. They used the slower, stockier Canar, the ship which really conquered the Atlantic. Canars were about 50 feet stem to stern, and were half-decked, fore and aft, providing space for the crew. Livestock was penned amidships. These merchant canars were far more vital to Scandinavia than the more glamorous longships.
Alright, moving along here.
Carpet
Skimming along. Get to some true facts.
back into the old wood.
Some carvings, actual carvings and stones.
The invitation of our Lord in Denmark. Himself all
from the Vikings.
many remained constant. Harold blew to it.
Yeah, let's see this one.
Plains of Norway. After the Christian.
Sorry about this.
Unthinkable.
Bear with me.
South and West. 500 years before St. Augustine brought Romanized Christianity to the country. The unthinkable.
Let's get back here for a second.
But now a new thought was starting to influence the pagan Vikings, from frequent contact with the English, many of whom were Christian. This faith had long been an influence in the British Isles, especially in the South and West, 500 years before St. Augustine brought Romanized Christianity to the country. The unthinkable was about to happen. Vikings were starting to put aside their Norse gods to accept the Christian faith, which certainly made slow progress until the royal families of Norway accepted it. This cross at Middleton, Yorkshire, has a representation of a Viking carved into it. It is true that in some cases Norse kings fell back into the old ways, but many remained constant. Harold Bluetooth was one, and at a one-time pagan sanctuary at Yelling, Jutland, raised a great runestone upon which he had engraved, King Harold had this memorial made for Gorm, his father, and Thiri, his mother, the Harold who won for himself all Denmark and Norway, and who made the Danes Christian. On this great stone is the figure of Christ, the first representation of our Lord in Denmark. In introducing the Christian faith in the Kiev region, Vladimir the Holy demonstrated a typical Viking characteristic. After ceremoniously smashing the local Thor idol, he threw the wooden remains into the river. Following this dramatic act, Vladimir ordered the entire local population into the river at the point of the sword for a mass baptism. One of the attractions of the baptismal service, especially with the ladies, was the gift of a white baptismal robe. Some were so enthused with their baptism that they came back for a second service, thus obtaining a second robe. The conversion of the Vikings to the Christian faith was slow. Many centuries of adherence to the worship of Odin and Thor could not easily be blotted out overnight.
You can watch my video Easter, the Astaroth Ishtar pagan holiday.
Twilight. But it was the twilight of the Norse gods, and Christianity was ultimately to triumph. Many Vikings became Christians simply by exposure to God-fearing families in England, daughters greatly influencing their pagan husbands. Conversion by example. This is Winchester, ancient capital city of Wessex, and here stands a statue of one of England's greatest kings, Alfred. In 854, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that the heathen for the first time remained in England over the winter instead of returning home. Only this man, Alfred, had the capability of defeating the invaders. But prior to his sea victories, he had to remain hidden among the marsh and bogs of the Somerset wetlands. But even from this remote area, he was able to assemble an army. He was also able to beat the Vikings at their own game, for his ship designers, much to the surprise of the Vikings, were able to design ships that were not only larger, but faster than the long ships of the Vikings. These were totally an English design, and when Alfred's fleet engaged the Vikings in 896, it promptly captured 2 of them and disabled 2 more. It was not long before a major sea battle off Weymouth Bay left 20 Viking ships at the bottom of the English Channel. Finally, at Wetmore in Somerset, Alfred and the Vikings signed a peace treaty, which confined them to the eastern part of England. This was their territory, and was under Dane law. However, it was an uneasy peace. The southern Saxons and the western Celts looked upon the Danish settlement as the robin looks upon the cuckoo in her nest. Towards the close of the 10th century, Vikings began to pour into the country from all directions, in spite of the vast quantities of silver called Danegeld paid to the invaders. Luckily for the future of the English nation, the Vikings stayed, thus infusing into Celt and Saxon the Nordic line.
By the year 960, raid after raid on the churches and monasteries of England, France, and Ireland had left the country stripped of plunder, with ruined and impoverished farmhouses, untilled fields. In France, King Charles bought off many Viking freebooters with Danegeld amounting to thousands of pounds weight of silver, and a baby boy was born out of wedlock, who in later life was to have a devastating effect on the future of England. His name was William in English. He was a direct descendant of the Normanni, or Northmen, which gave their name to the land, Normandy. William fell in love with his pretty cousin Matilda and proposed marriage. "I'd sooner become a nun than marry a bastard," was Matilda's curt reply. Immediately upon receiving this stinging answer, William rode furiously over to Matilda's castle, seizing her by her long hair, dragged her screaming across the floor. Matilda, somewhat impressed with William's overtures, then decided that she loved him after all, married him, and made for William the Conqueror a very level-headed and intelligent Queen of England, to whom William remained totally faithful, to the surprise of his later biographers.
A vivid pictorial account of William's invasion of England has been preserved in the Bayeux tapestry. Both Harald Hardrada of Norway and Svein Estrithson of Denmark had laid claims to the English throne, but so did William. The tapestry shows in dramatic form shipwrights chopping down trees and preparing the wood for the many invasion barges, their lines so similar to the Viking longships. The Normans walked their horses down to the barges, the nervous animals needing some encouragement. Then the invasion armada set sail for England. He says, and the tapestry says, "We make for Pevensey," and continues, "We hasten ashore." His fleet landed without difficulty at Pevensey in Sussex, and a local rail station is named in honor of this event. The hungry must be fed, and we made camp at Hastings. Here they built this castle, the first in England, on an almost impregnable headland. Harold is told that the invaders are putting the country to fire and sword, and he marches south. At Senlac Field, the Norman cavalry advance, then break into a charge, and the battle for Britain commences. The results of the battle are well known. The English King Harold is killed, and on Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England, greatly to that country's benefit. This event brought the Viking Age nearly to its close. Very few historians seem to be able to point to the original homeland of the Vikings, but a faint light illuminates a surprising location: the Middle East. The historian David Wilson states in his book, The Vikings and Their Origins, Goths, the ancestors of the Vikings, inhabited the Baltic coast and spread into Europe, westward from the Black Sea area in about 300 AD. Centuries earlier, their ancestors were Cimmerian and Scythian Israel, also on their westward migration. Wilson's origin for the Vikings as Cimmerians and Scythian Israel has been confirmed by Assyrian cuneiform tablets found in Nineveh, in the excavations of the Royal Library of King Ashurbanipal. Translated by Professor Waterman of the University of Michigan, they report the escape of hundreds of thousands of the so-called lost tribes of Israel westward, at about the same time in history as the vast numbers of Scythians appear in history. It is a fact that after the fall of the Assyrian capital Nineveh in 612 BC, the Israel people, known by several different names, spread all around the shore of the Black Sea and into southern Russia, then called Scythia, then gradually into southeastern Europe. They took the name of the country they passed through, thus they were called Scythians, ancient progenitors of the Viking people. In the 1st century, Tacitus wrote of the people who must surely have sired the Vikings. The Suenes, a people well-armed, acquisitive, and skilled in the sailing of curiously shaped ships, with a carved prow at either end. The route lay always westward, following the setting sun, towards a new land that they were then not even aware of, the isles and coastlands of the West. One group of the Scandinavians came a Viking to the British Isles, later to infuse into the bloodline of the Celto-Saxon English that Nordic strain which fathered an inherent desire to see what was over the next horizon, be it land or sea. Their curiosity led them to discover a new land far to the west, America. But that is another story, in another program. Israel's migration westward was part of a great trans-Europe movement. They were called over the generations by many different names: Normans, Saxons, Danes, Gauls, Goths, and Vikings. All originally one Caucasian people, displaying many of the later Viking characteristics. Thanks to archaeology, we have proof of the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, as written into the scriptures, that he would become the father of many nations, and would spread to the south, the north, the east, and the west, and that his descendants would become as multitudinous as the sands of the seashore, and as the stars in their courses.
That would be what Abraham means, the father of many nations. So thanks for watching. You can look it up yourselves. Raymond Capt, They Came a Viking. You can check it out. Probably find it at Shepherd's Chapel that carries it. You can get it from them, the Shepherd's Chapel. And thanks for watching.